for 16 years, but I always love coming back, and I've really appreciated hearing the presentations on all the other activities that are going on in maternal and child health. But I am from Christiana Care Health Services, and I just want to note that because primarily today I gathered my comments from the U.S. perspective, but I believe it's not all that different from other countries that are conducting maternal and child health, because we're all influenced by the same international standards. So my charge was to look at 3 elements of protecting human subjects, their rights and welfare. So I'll start with institutional review boards, which are often commonly called ethics committees as well. So regardless of what we happen to name them, the basic responsibilities are to serve as an administrative body established to protect rights and the welfare of human research subjects recruited for research under the auspices of the institution served by the IRB. Generally, IRBs serve one institution, but you can have a review body that does serve multiple. And the important thing is that they are to have the authority to approve, to require modification, or to disapprove all research activities that fall within their jurisdiction. And generally, no matter what country you're in, whether you're in the US, the UK, some other country, there are usually governmental regulations that have to be adhered to. And most important, obviously, for the IRB to know what those are and to also apply them. But some of my remarks today come from the guidebook that has been developed by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services to help educate both IRB members and other participants in ethical reviews. So major responsibilities are, first of all, to determine what constitutes human subject research. And that isn't necessarily a definition that is without change. Just to give you an example, soon in the United States, we did infant screening, newborn screening, and it had been customary to take some of the blood samples that were left over after they ran the various tests and to use them for research or understanding the populations and characteristics. And soon they will have to get parental permission in order to use those samples in any research. So that will soon be upon us. Most important is that they weigh the possible benefits of conducting the research against the possible risk. And again, I mentioned that they can either approve, require modifications, or they can disapprove. We also consider that they need to give information out as they have to ensure that the information that is provided to the potential subject is consistent with applicable laws and regulations. And I read an article that nicely states that doing research with human subjects is not a right. Therefore, if we're going to involve human subjects, we need to get their consent. They need to be volunteers in the process. And that is what authorizes us to go, in fact, and engage human subjects in research. And they can determine whether the required documentation for informed consent must be written or oral. And of course, there are consent requirements that do vary somewhat in countries. For instance, in India, there will soon be audio-visual recording, at least of a good percentage of research, and that is a fairly new requirement, as I understand it. They also have the responsibility to notify investigators in writing of their decision to approve, require modifications, or disapprove. And although you don't exactly have an appeal process, investigators can come back and either after they've made modifications or come back and present various arguments in terms of why the research should be approved as it as it had been presented. But getting initial approval to conduct the study is only the first step, because it's important that they also do continuing reviews to make sure that the research is being carried out as it was intended, and that regulations are being, the research is being carried out consistent with the regulations. And they can suspend or terminate it either because there is non-compliance with regulations, or perhaps because of unexpected events, adverse outcomes. And then sometimes we find we learned what we needed to know before the end of the study, and in some cases like that, it makes sense to have the study stopped. Usually an investigator, however, will be aware of that situation too. It won't be an action undertaken by only the IRB. I wanted to point this out because when we started the global network, one of the first things we had to do was work with people here in India, and they got the same federal-wide assurance that our IRBs in the United States were required to. And basically the way we've operated is that the projects have to be reviewed here in India, and once they're approved here, then our IRB in the States will act upon the research. When there are multiple IRBs involved, though, I think it's really important to clearly sit down with each other, determine what's different about the processes, who goes first, who goes second, any other special issues around what those procedures are going to be. These are some of my own thoughts are what makes an IRB function effectively. First of all, I think they need to maintain transparency, and one way you do this is you have in your share your written standards, standard operating procedures. So most IRBs in the United States, especially associated with universities, will have everything up on a website for everybody to see. Their schedule of meetings, what forms you need to use, various detailed instructions. But you also need a diverse membership and with varied backgrounds. You need expertise, you need to involve faculty from different disciplines, and you need to involve people that understand the research process. But I've underlined, something in that. You also need non-scientists and community members, representatives of special and vulnerable populations. And I think if we fall down in the United States, sometimes we don't carefully select representatives from some of those groups, and I think they're really needed to be effective. And IRBs need to understand the surrounding environment and the roles of other entities. They really can't operate strictly on their own, so they need to be aware of the federal regulations. In the United States, we have an Office of Human Research Protection. You need to be very aware and follow their guidelines. Okay, investigator responsibilities, and I'm assuming that these are not going to be new information for many of the people in this room. But one thing that I think is important is investigators to handle the job of an investigator, and particularly a principal investigator who's kind of really in charge of the research and the rest of the team, needs to get sufficient experience and educational background. And now there are so many mentoring programs for young researchers that they should avail themselves of those opportunities. They need to take whatever training is required for them to take on the task of doing research. And really, really important is that they need to design good research. If it's well-designed research, when it goes before a review committee, the chances of it being approved as written without having to go through modifications, I think, is increased. And they need to provide truthful and sufficient information so that the review committee has the information that they need. And again, they have to follow the policies and procedures that have been outlined. looking at the informed consent and how they propose to give the subjects enough information is really an important job of the investigator. Often institutions will provide a template, but the real responsibility of the investigator to make sure that the information is truthful, as easy for the subject to understand as possible. They need to provide progress reports and request for continuing review and approval in accordance with the institution's and regulatory requirements. Another important activity is they need to report promptly to the IRB and abide by all the requirements for serious adverse events that may occur during the research, and that's really, really important. And I found that it's something that sometimes isn't very well understood, and sometimes people just don't follow the procedures that they should be, and I would stress that that's really important to have a clear understanding before you hope that none will happen, but you need to report them sufficiently, and some things that will happen won't be associated with the research, but if you haven't gotten the information that you need, it's hard to make that decision. And you need to keep certain records for the length of time required. And then you have responsibilities upon completion of the research as well, especially as it relates to data and maintaining confidentiality, and any particular commitments that you've made for the subject, like incentives or protecting their privacy and the information that you share. And most of all, you need to report findings accurately. Sponsor may be your institution, because usually who's ever funding the research, such as the NIH or ICMR, I know they fund research, they basically make the agreement to carry out the research with the institution, not personally with the investigator. But sponsors also have a role. For instance, in the United States, we'll have requests for applications, and then the funding agency will pick the investigator. So that's one of the first things: pick the best investigator to carry out the research that you want conducted. Ensure proper monitoring. Ensure that all the reviews are carried out on a timely basis, and prepare and submit the clinical trial applications. For instance, assure that if there had to be a approval by the drug controller here in India or the FDA or anything, that all those things happen before before the research goes forward. Again, if there's any changes in the study, if there's anything that needs to be changed, the sponsor needs to make sure that everything is being done appropriately and follow the regulations and procedures. We have some constraints in terms of engaging in promotional activities if it's a investigative medical device or even a drug that's a new drug or being tested. And you need to ensure that the clinical study is conducted in accordance with good clinical practice. And basically, this is probably the most important slide of the whole presentation, and that is that really protecting human subjects needs to be recognized as a shared responsibility. So you've got you have the person that is, member of the public that is to be your subject, and again, your main objective is protecting their welfare and their rights. You've got any number of national, state, local governmental agencies that may be involved in the process. You've got the institution that is served by the IRB, but you might also have like a governmental sponsor or a Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that is a sponsor. And then you have your ethics committee and the investigator. And concentrating on developing the right culture and environment and creating an environment of trust, respect, and realizing that you're all out for the same purpose, and that's to protect human subjects, is very, very important. Thank you very much, and